Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here. We have such a nice, large group this evening, and uh, we're happy to see each and every one of you. This evening, it has been our honor to have with us a guest named Julian Zelizer. Um, Professor Zelizer was brought to us, shall we say, by David Alpern, who you can see in your screen, and David and Professor Zelizer will have a bit of a conversation, but I'd like to say a few words about Professor Zelizer. He's been among the pioneers in the revival of American political history, and he's the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes class of 1941, not him, by the way, not him, professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, as well as a CNN political analyst and a regular guest on NPR's Here and Now. He's the author and editor of 20 books, including The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society, published in 2015, which was the winner of the D.B. Hardiman Prize for the best book on Congress, and Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974, published by Norton, and co-authored with Kevin Kruse. His new book that he'll be speaking about tonight is titled Burning Down the House, Newt Gingrich, The Fall of a Speaker, and the Rise of the New Republican Party, published by Penguin Press this year. He's also currently writing a book about Abraham Joshua Heschel for the Jewish Lives series of Yale University Press. Professor Zelizer, who has published over 1,000 op-ed pieces, has received fellowships from the Brookings Institution, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, the New York Historical Society, and New America. He also co-hosts a popular podcast called Politics and Polls, which we will be on the lookout for. And he informs us this evening that he has made a pandemic purchase of a home in Sag Harbor. He's very happy to be out here part-time. So thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Before we get this started, I just want to say a couple of words about David Alpern, whom some of you have seen as a regular program presenter at the Rogers Memorial Library over the last couple of years. In addition to having been a longtime senior editor at Newsweek magazine, he also hosted a radio show for many years. He has done several programs airing segments from his radio interviews. And he's also been the creator of a little series at the library called Coffee and Conversation, which we've come up with over maybe the last year or so. And that's been a really wonderful series. So he's been very generous with our library. And so thank you very much, David, for your generosity and for finding us terrific people. By the way, including Stephen Schlesinger. I don't know if you can see Stephen Schlesinger, but he's in our audience. And he was our last guest for David's Coffee and Conversation. So thank you very much, David. Let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, thanks, Penny.
Yeah.
Thanks to all of you in Zoomhampton for joining us. Special thanks to Professor Zelizer, who was a frequent guest on my old radio show and now a neighbor in Sag Harbor. Penny and I agreed on inviting the professor to a library Zoom back in the summer when I interviewed his latest book for the East Hampton Star, but we agreed it should wait until after the election so we could talk both about how the once proud grand old party came to be captured by a brash real estate buccaneer turned TV celebrity like Donald Trump, and how that unlikely political marriage, Trump himself, and the national interest would fare at the polls 4 years on. Of course, the election is foremost on our minds right now, but I think it would be a mistake to jump ahead to that when the professor has provided such fascinating research and analysis on the role Newt Gingrich played in setting the stage for all of this. In Burning Down the House, we're reminded of what former President Barack Obama had to say on the matter. Quote, Donald Trump is not an outlier. He is a culmination, a logical conclusion to the rhetoric and tactics of the Republican Party for the past 10, 15, 20 years. No governing principles, no one to say, no, this is going too far. This isn't what we stand for, unquote. Julian, talk about the way that style of rhetoric and tactics rose from the shame of Watergate as analyzed and weaponized by Newt Gingrich.
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me. And David, it's great to do this with you, and it is great to be a resident of Sag Harbor. So I look forward to being able to do this in person as well. I didn't imagine we'd have this discussion after an election while the president is challenging the legitimacy of the outcome, which in many ways fits the story of the book. But the book is about a young, very brash Republican, Newt Gingrich, who had a PhD in history from Tulane, who had taught for a few years at West Georgia College, but quickly grew disinterested in politics, who comes to Washington after running several times in 1979. And it's a moment when Republicans were feeling pretty bad. Watergate still cast a shadow over the party, and it was unclear how the party would rebuild itself. And on Capitol Hill, Republicans had not been in power in either the House or the Senate since 1955. And before that, they were only in power for 2 sessions since 1932. So they thought of themselves as a powerless minority, a permanent minority in Capitol Hill. And here comes Gingrich in '79, and he says, this is ridiculous, and I'm going to deliver a majority. We're going to work to make Republicans the party in charge. And that becomes even more important after 1980 when Reagan is elected. And as we'll discuss now, he was willing to do almost anything. And he was willing to urge his colleagues to do almost anything in pursuit of partisan power. And that's the context. And one other part of him, and I'll stop, is this is all happening when Vietnam and Watergate had created immense distrust in this country toward government institutions and leaders. And so Gingrich's principal argument when he comes to Capitol Hill is not a left-right kind of argument, or not even liberal conservative. It was that Democrats were a fundamentally corrupt establishment, and that the only way the people would ever thrive is if the Democrats were brought down.
And indeed, he used some post-Watergate reforms that enforced transparency on which to base his attacks on Democrats. So the book talks about his first 2 failed attempts at Congress. He couldn't unseat a veteran Democrat, war hero, racist, and he got a chance when a non-office holder was put up by the Democrats. But the first thing he did when he got to the House was find a Democratic target to pick on. So tell us about that first fight in Congress.
Yeah, the first person he goes after is Congressman Charlie Diggs, who was one of the founders of the Congressional Black Caucus, Michigan Democrat, who found himself in trouble. He was being investigated for various ethics violations, including allegations that he had provided kickbacks to staff members. But the investigation was ongoing, and Gingrich instantly, within a few months, goes after Diggs. And he basically says, until this investigation is over, Democrats shouldn't let him participate. He shouldn't be able to vote. He shouldn't be able to speak. And many Democrats were taken aback. The party decided what happens to a member as an investigation is ongoing. They're like, who's Newt Gingrich, a first-term congressman from the South? Some Republicans warned Gingrich, maybe going after a very prominent African-American legislator as your first target isn't the best thing for your image and for the image of the party, but he didn't stop. He was incredibly persistent to the point that Diggs is censured on the floor in large part because of what Gingrich had done. And instantly, within a few months, Gingrich had made a name for himself, and it was the ethics rules created to clean up Washington and to clean up Congress that he weaponized and saw as a tool for the Republicans to go after Democratic power.
Let's look at Newt's political prehistory. It's one of the charming points of your book. Starting at the age of 11, literally fighting City Hall in the Pennsylvania capital of Harrisburg. Tell us that story, the coverage it got for him, and how it turned out.
Yeah, he always had this political instinct in him. His family was originally from Hummelstown, which is near Harrisburg, and one day at 11 years of age, he took a bus to Harrisburg to see some documentary movies that were playing. And he loved wildlife, he loved zoos. He watched this movie about wildlife and he left, and he didn't understand why Harrisburg didn't have a zoo. And he decided that day to go to the government offices, and he just appeared, this little kid, at the front doors of the government building. And he said he wanted to meet with officials, and an official took a meeting with him, and he sat down in the chair and spoke to them about why isn't there a zoo, and he made a case for why Harrisburg should have one. He didn't get the zoo in the end, but the government officials were totally taken by this young man. They sent him home in a nice car, and a local paper editor, Paul Walker, took notice of him, wrote a story that went out on the AP about this kid who was lobbying for a zoo and would continue to be a mentor for Gingrich during some of his childhood.
And even a little later, introduced him to a lot of politicians, I think mostly Democrats, and got him his first media jobs.
That's exactly right. Gingrich wrote for this local paper that Walker edited. It was primarily advertisements, one of the papers that thrives on that, with some local news. He also let him help out on a radio show. And very early on, not only is he mentoring him, but this is important for Gingrich's career, he's giving him a taste of how the media works and the importance of the media in the modern political landscape.
Some years later, visiting a World War I battlefield, young Newt begins to see the politics of much larger issues than a local zoo.
That's right. So he spends a lot of his youth, his teenage years before high school, traveling around Europe. When Newt was born, his biological father left his mom right after they got married, and while she was pregnant, she remarried a man who was in the army. And so they spent some time traveling around Europe. And when they went to visit this site on one of the free weekends that he had, Gingrich was very taken by the remnants of World War I. He actually saw bones from bodies that were buried there. And he started to see the world and politics in very moralistic terms of good versus evil. And he always recounted that visit as having a huge impression on the way he would conduct business in Washington.
Jumping ahead a few years, you note that Gingrich morphed from Rockefeller Republican to Nixon supporter. I sensed it was less about ideology and principles than successful tactics and strategy. Is that about right?
I think that's true. It's funny, because Gingrich has a PhD and taught history for a while, and because of the way he conducts himself, he's often talked about as a big idea Republican. But I think looking back, he's more a tactician, a power broker, and that's correct. In the late 60s, he was very much a Rockefeller Republican. The person he really liked was Richard Nixon. And he liked Nixon a lot because he thought Nixon was a Republican who was trying to build a grand coalition and do what FDR did in the 1930s for the GOP. And he switches pragmatically. He runs in 1974 for the first time against Congressman Flint, who you mentioned, as a Rockefeller Republican, and loses. He runs again then a couple of years later, and he shifted to the right. And he starts to meet people in the new conservative movement that was sweeping through the country. He takes a class with a guy named Paul Weyrich, who's one of the leading conservative activists. And he sees that that's the path within the Republican Party that's more exciting and more energetic. He's not totally committed to any, really, I think, beyond tax cuts and a strong defense of the specifics of the movement, but he understands that's the path for the Republican Party to start coming back into power.
Promoted to GOP whip after Ronald Reagan's 1980 victory, Newt's greatest success was the unseating of House Speaker Jim Wright, part of the subtitle of your book, again with hazy ethical charges. Talk about how the old line Republican leaders reacted to his tough and, by their standards, pretty ungentlemanly tactics, but also about their success.
Yeah, I mean, that's at the heart of my book. Takes place in the 1980s, and Gingrich in the early 80s is really seen in the best terms as a maverick, in the worst terms as a new Joe McCarthy. And many Republican leaders like Bob Michel, who's the House Minority Leader, don't think much of him. They think he's dangerous. They think he says things that are not good for the health of the institution, and that he goes too low, and that it wouldn't be good for the Republicans or for just Congress if someone like Gingrich had too much power. But my story is about how gradually they're seduced by what he's doing, even if they don't particularly like him, because of that promise he made that he would bring back a majority for the Republicans. Over the course of the 80s, they start to believe he might be onto something. And the story culminates with him taking down the Speaker of the House, Jim Wright, using ethics accusations. And in the middle of that, the Republicans have an open position, House Minority Whip, because the existing whip, Dick Cheney, had been appointed Secretary of Defense by George H.W. Bush. And they vote to make Gingrich this position, which is part of the leadership, which is significant in Washington. That's a path that makes you the minority leader or the speaker. And again, Bob Michel still didn't like Gingrich, but by 1989, when he becomes whip, they think there's something to what Gingrich is doing. They like this no guardrails kind of partisanship, because it culminates in 89 with him taking down the Speaker of the House. First time it had happened in American history. And a few years later, you fast forward to 1994, Republicans retake control of the House, and Gingrich becomes the Speaker, institutionalizing this style of smash mouth partisanship at the highest levels of power in the GOP.
Jim Wright left the chamber that he really loved, hoping in vain that the pendulum of personal attack would quickly swing away. But what did swing away was the pendulum of power for Gingrich after overreaching as Speaker himself and Times Man of the Year. Talk about those overreachings of his and the price he had to pay for them.
Yeah, I mean, when Jim Wright retired, he decides to step down on May 31st, 1989. He makes this long speech, 1 hour speech, which is considered a great piece of oratory. And Wright says, I'm facing these ethics charges. And he goes through each one and says, they're not true. I didn't break any ethics laws. I didn't violate any other laws. And he says, I'm really not guilty of anything. He says, bad judgment, yes. He said, we are not perfect. He is not perfect as a politician. But then he says in a famous moment that he will step down, he will give up the seat he loves so that a mindless cannibalism doesn't sweep through the Congress and destroy it. And he's telling Gingrich, stop, stand down, so to speak. And he's telling Democrats also, don't respond in kind. But that's not how it unfolds. The partisanship intensifies. Gingrich's style of partisanship becomes normative. And as Speaker, Gingrich ultimately suffers the same fate. First, Gingrich overreaches in his battles with Bill Clinton in 1995 and 96, leading to the shutdown of the federal government, which Gingrich thinks will benefit him, but the blowback is against the Republicans for not knowing how to govern. And then in 1997, Newt Gingrich becomes the first speaker fined for ethics violations, and one of the great ironies of politics in that era. The guy who made his way up through using ethics is himself guilty of not following the ethics rules. And then finally, during the impeachment of Bill Clinton, this reaches a high point in November and December of 1998. The first thing that happens is Republicans don't do well in the midterms, right as the House is getting ready to vote on whether Clinton should be impeached for lying about an affair with an intern. And so Republicans are not happy that the midterms don't go well. They're also not happy that Gingrich is having an affair right at this time, that this is the main story for him. And so he is basically pushed out. I mean, it's ironic. It's also fitting. I mean, he created Gingrich a scorched earth world in Congress where everyone could be brought down and be brought down fast. So it's logical he would be one of the first victims.
The 2012 Gingrich presidential campaign was a flop, but 4 years later, he was delighted to learn he was on Donald Trump's VP shortlist. How and why did he talk himself out of the honor, and on Fox, no less?
Yeah, this is great. I mean, I didn't write this book with Donald Trump in mind. I had actually finished most of it before this other book I wrote. I put it aside. So it was kind of done. It was really when the Tea Party had come to town, the Freedom Caucus during the Obama years. And but then I framed it in terms of President Trump. I start the book with that because President Trump practices the same kind of politics that Gingrich called for. There are no rules, there are no boundaries to what you do, and winning power is the principle, above governing, above the health of institutions. So first, one connection was when Gingrich ran for president in 2012, his advisor was Kellyanne Conway. She crafted a campaign for him, a kind of populist campaign, which he used against Mitt Romney, but then ultimately didn't win the primary. And then in 2016, Gingrich emerged as one of the most vocal supporters for Donald Trump, even as many other Republicans were not yet giving him their support. And he ends up being one of the finalists for the vice presidential slot. It was down to Mike Pence, who obviously gets it, Gingrich, and Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey. And there's a meeting that I start with where he goes to Indianapolis, where Trump had just met with Pence. And then he meets with Gingrich. The family meets with Gingrich, the sons, Paul Manafort, and some of the other campaign managers. And they like Gingrich a lot, actually. It goes well. Gingrich sounds a lot like Trump. They're worried that you can't have two high voltage people and that Trump would not be comfortable with that, but it goes pretty well. And then Gingrich goes on Fox News, on Sean Hannity's show after the meeting that night from a station in Indianapolis. And it's a remarkable interview. Sean Hannity loved Gingrich, and he actually wanted him to get the position. And Gingrich starts the interview explaining why he's so great and why he would be perfect for the job. And he says that he and Trump are just the same kind of people. They're pirates, he says. They're constantly fighting all the establishment and their own people. But then he almost talks people out of it, which is classic Gingrich. You just say what's on your mind. And he says it might be that two pirates on one ticket is just too much. And I think in the end, that is what the Trump team concluded. My guess is Trump didn't want to share the spotlight with someone else who's so present, and he went with Pence. Gingrich has remained a very supportive person. He's written a series of books about why the Trump presidency was transformative. He's on Fox television all the time, usually supporting President Trump at the worst moments of the presidency. And even a few days ago, he was one of the first Republicans to come out and say the election was stolen in Pennsylvania, and went so far as to say that the administration should send in officials to arrest election workers who he said were fraudulently handling the ballots, and the president retweeted what he said. So he remained very much in the Trumpian orbit, so to speak, using Fox television as a main platform.
Trump, you write, was thriving in the political world that Gingrich had created. Reading your book and others about Trump, I got a sense of converging kismet. Newt seemed to learn the increasing power of television, the importance of sensation and emotion from working in politics. Trump learned about playing to a political base from building his audience in television. Is today politics more than ever television?
It is. And even though I didn't set out to make television and the media a central part of Gingrich's story, it quickly became apparent just how vital that was. Just a brief story is one of the key moments in my book is when Gingrich isn't very well known yet in 1984, he and his colleagues start to realize that this sleepy new cable channel called C-SPAN that covered whoever was speaking on the floor could be incredibly useful. And he and a group of conservatives went at the end of every day and made a 1-minute speech. Anyone's allowed to speak. And they would make these speeches about why the Democrats were weak on defense, how they didn't care about the safety of the nation. And increasingly, they got more blistering, and they started to attack specific Democrats. And what you couldn't see was that the camera was only covering the person speaking. You couldn't see the chamber was totally empty at that point of the day. And Gingrich and Trent Lott and other Republicans were calling on specific Democrats. Congressman Boland, you know, you don't support American security. And there's no response. If you're watching on C-SPAN, it looked like, you know, there's no answer. And it culminates with Tip O'Neill, the speaker at the time, coming in and showing the whole chamber, having the camera pan the chamber to show that this is political theater. Tip O'Neill makes a speech saying this is the lowest thing he's seen in his entire career in politics. And it all culminates, though, with exactly what Gingrich wants. All the major networks cover this story at night, and they talk about cam scam. But Gingrich gets his argument on the air because even though they're covering it in a negative light, the message is out there, and he's the star. And after that, Gingrich said, you have to give television more Indiana Jones than Philharmonic. And he also said in another interview that you don't get on television wearing a seatbelt. And I think he very much understood that sensationalism and commercialism and controversial appetite of the media as it was unfolding, not just television, but even print and radio. And I think we're now in an era where that has totally defined how so much of the media operates, and both men thrive on getting out their very toxic rhetoric and accusations and having it circulate before it's too late to undo.
Well, there are two other factors I'd like you to comment on. One, simultaneous or parallel, was the rise of the religious right as a political force. And the other, which we're living through right now, was increasingly pervasive social media that permit like-minded Americans to see the world strictly through the lens of their preference, share their grievances, share their provocations, and form a more powerful or cohesive entity, even if far-flung, and especially far-flung.
I think both are important. The religious right has been central to the post-Reagan or the Reagan through today coalition. And the religious right has been very important in delivering the vote, in being connected to what Republicanism is. So there's this image of being the moral majority, the party on the side of traditional moral values. I think the way the Republican kind of conservatism, or religious conservatism has changed, it's become more institutionalized. By the time Gingrich is speaker in the mid-90s, you have people like Ralph Reed who are very sophisticated politically, and it's less of a kind of movement as opposed to a political operation that has money, that has a structure, to where it is today, where it can quickly deliver the vote. So it's been instrumental. You see how pragmatic the religious right has been. They are fine working with people like Gingrich, who had multiple affairs, all known in public, and who didn't live a life that you expect in the church, but remained one of their key players. And you see that right through Donald Trump. Social media is obviously, it comes after Gingrich's political career is pretty much winding down, but it is allowing for the extension and use of Gingrich principles. I mean, Gingrich was very big on the importance of political rhetoric as a tool for Republicans. And there's a memo I cite that he first put out in 1990 through an organization called GOPAC, which was basically a political action committee. And he sent this memo to Republicans who were running in the 1990 midterms. And it said, if you want to speak like Newt, these are the kinds of words you have to use. And the list of words at the time was kind of out there. You have to call Democrats sick and traitorous and that sort of thing, which today seems normal. But back then that was a big push. And I think social media has allowed politicians and political actors to get that language out much more easily. It's a media ecosystem without a filter. When Gingrich was in power, there were still more, I think, guardrails in the media, more sources of editorial and production control. That's gone. And so I think it's natural that in the age of social media, the use of the kind of language Gingrich was thinking about, made much worse now, and it will continue to get worse, I think, it works very well in the current platform. In addition to creating more pockets of polarized information gathering. When Gingrich was coming to power, you didn't even have Fox News yet. His platform was still the mainstream media, C-SPAN, cable television, the New York Times. Now we're in a world where that same political mindset operates in a way where you can only speak to the people who already support you.
How central do you see the Newt-like blunt force tactics of Trump's presidency as key to his rejection in last week's election, turning off too many in his audience, even as other Republican candidates down ballot were doing much better than been expected? Or did the pandemic, its economic devastation, and the way Trump has handled it clearly overshadow everything else?
Yeah, I tend to think it was more the pandemic and the sense of just instability in government. And I think it was also just Democrats mobilizing as opposed to Republicans flipping. I think Democrats were able to do a much better job in this election, making sure people came out to vote or voted by mail. And Trump himself created a lot of energy because of his policies, I think, were very rightward. And so in the end, I don't know. I think there's a lot of stomach in the modern Republican Party for much of what the president does. And that's on display right now. I mean, the president is challenging the results of an election. Most Republicans are either being silent, elected officials, or actually joining him in this. And so I think the Republican Party is not so far off. I think this was really about Democrats just gaining much more support. And it was about Democrats not liking Trump as opposed to Republicans turning away from him. That's my sense of it.
Well, let me stop you on that, though, because the Republicans down the ballot did so much more better. I mean, you have to say that to some significant degree, it was Republicans turning off on Trump as opposed to turning away from their party. I'd love to see some data on sort of total votes on the Republican side, because that gap is surprising. I don't think 5 million Republicans went Democratic. I think maybe 5 million Republicans said, we can't stand this guy, so let's just vote for the guys we know.
Could be. Again, he also received 71 million votes, which is also a pretty striking figure given how controversial he is. That's a high number. And I don't think a lot of pollsters predicted that was going to be the outcome. But you're right. We have to see what the data shows. But it's also another way to think about it is a lot of people were still willing to go with their senators or representatives of the party that has been defined by Trump, and where that party has been totally aligned with what the president is doing. And that didn't take Republican voters away from members. It took them away from him to some extent, but it didn't take them away from other members. So we just don't know yet. I think in the end, people like Stacey Abrams had a huge effect in terms of registering voters, and the mail-in voting was essential to get that working so that people could actually vote in the middle of a pandemic.
So what do you make of Trump's post-game show, we might call it, refusing to concede, launching lawsuits, sparking a social media tsunami, maybe starting campaign-style rallies, blocking the transition team context? Do you think largely temporary tactics to defend his fragile ego? Or is there a savvy strategy to pressure at least some GOP governors to ignore the popular vote when they send delegates to the Electoral College, maybe actually overturn the election?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above. I think part of what we're seeing is clearly a personal reaction from a leader who doesn't like to lose, doesn't like the idea that they can be defeated. And we've seen throughout his presidency, we've seen throughout his career, when he feels that way, he lashes out. And so that's part of what's going on. Second, I think, is to just, I do think, I don't know if it's a systematic strategy, but he fundamentally believes in discrediting opponents or discrediting bad news. And I think that's part of what you're seeing. He did it in 2016 when he won. He felt the need to go after this popular vote inconsistency with the Electoral College. And this is much more stinging, obviously, for him. So I think he is trying to explain away to the country, to his supporters, why he lost. And finally, if there is a strategy to speak of, it's exactly what you said. I don't think there's a lot of hope that votes are going to be found that are significant enough to overturn the results in all these states. But there's been a lot of articles suggesting the real end game is state governments to try to get them to overturn the will of the electorate. I would say, boy, that would be a big thing for any politician to do, especially in states that aren't, there's a lot of Democrats in those states, but we are now in the age of Trump where I think it's always dangerous to say, oh, that will never happen. I think that's part of the game. And then the other strategy people are talking about is he wants to rebuild himself for 2024, and that he's seriously thinking of running. He wants to remain a force. And so how do you do that? You argue this was stolen, and you convince followers and Republicans it was stolen, so that when you run a few years later, you come back a hero rather than someone who was defeated.
To the degree that Trump pouts and parts from partisan politics, who is the party's likeliest Trumpist or Trumpian leader, especially if Mitch McConnell loses his Senate majority? Another politician, or maybe another media figure like Tucker Carlson or one of his ilk?
Yeah, I look, my natural inclination is to look into the political shed and think of people like Ben Sasse or Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz, meaning Republicans who are pretty conservative, who overall, despite private grumbling, have been part of this modern Republican Party, but who are much more polished, who have, I think, a more sophisticated understanding of when you can and can't do things, but would reflect the same policy agenda generally, maybe not with trade, but almost everything else that Trump has been fighting for, and feel very comfortable in the Fox Breitbart world of conservative media. But I think you're right in that we need to think out of the box. And given that this just happened, maybe it's not a politician. Maybe it is someone like a Tucker Carlson who represents the same impulses and literally comes from the world of conservative media.
What about Republicans in Congress, especially if they hold a Senate working with a new Biden administration? Can the president-elect's personal ties across the aisle help all that much?
I'm not that optimistic. My book on Lyndon Johnson that I wrote a few years ago, part of the argument was really the condition of Congress plays a huge role in dictating what presidents can or can't do. And as we saw under Obama, this Republican Party, which has become more extreme since 2008, is not interested in compromise. And I think Senator McConnell right now is showing he's not so buddy-buddy with Joe Biden. He's questioning the election as well. And my sense is on most issues, obstruction will be the name of the game if they control the Senate. And they will do everything possible to prevent Biden from having a big agenda. Does that mean it's impossible? No. There's certain issues where I think President Biden will have leverage on Republicans. If you're dealing with economic relief from the pandemic, if you're dealing with certain public health issues as a vaccine is being rolled out, there's ways in which Biden can force Republicans into a position of saying no to something their constituents want, or yes, and going along with the administration. And then the administration, like President Trump, like President Obama, has executive power and can reinstate climate change rules, can re-enter the Paris Agreement. So I think there's a lot of movement. I don't think there's going to be some great cordial working relationship, though, between the Republicans on Capitol Hill and the White House.
And how about the larger challenge of closing the wide divides throughout the country, political, economic, racial, cultural, what some are calling the two Americas? The pandemic has put a lot of divergent groups in the same boat in terms of medical vulnerability, lost income, anxiety, stress, but without engineering nearly the level of patriotic unity called for by Biden and a lot of others. So what do you see ahead for us?
Yeah, I wish I could be optimistic, but I'm not. And I think the outcome of the election, even though I do believe it was a pretty decisive win by Biden, even though I know some are saying it wasn't, in terms of he rebuilt the blue wall, he might have expanded into 2 states that were part of the red wall, and he got a huge popular vote, but Trump got a huge vote as well. And so that suggests to me that tens of millions of voters were very comfortable or somewhat comfortable with Trumpian republicanism. And that doesn't go away. And I think the way things are unfolding now in this post-election period is only going to energize anger and incite those who voted for Trump. And it's going to anger, incite, and really make many Democrats furious about what the Republicans are doing. And then beyond this, beyond Trump, beyond this election, we're divided for reasons that date back decades, from the way our media works to the direction, I would argue, the Republican Party, to gerrymandering and campaign finance. We have all these structures that keep perpetuating division. And so I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. And this election isn't a reason to suspect we're entering into a period of bipartisan peace.
All right, a final question for me before we open it up to the audience. What's the best place to buy, or the best places to buy your new book, Burning Down the House, here in the Hamptons or online?
You can do any bookstore is good. I'm an independent bookstore person. I know the bookstore in Sag Harbor has had the book since it came out. And I believe some of the other bookstores in the area probably have it as well. So I like to support the local community if we can. That's the best place.
All right, we can take some questions from the audience now. So please wave your hand in front of your camera or use the hand icon or the chat and wait to be recognized and unmuted. Who's got something to ask or to say?
Well, I just want to add that I know that Canio's book specifically ordered copies of your book for tonight. So that was very good of her, and they have them there. So
fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank
Mike
you.
Hadjad, you raised your hand?
Yes, I did raise my finger. First of all, thank you very much, Julian, for a very insightful talk, and I look forward to reading your book. There is a colleague of yours at Princeton called Fintan O'Toole, who wrote recently a very trenchant, brilliantly written article about the era he sees in American politics as entering into an era of what he calls post-democracy. And he accuses the Republican Party of being actually post-democratic, of using every means possible to secure autocratic power that only could work because they're really becoming a minority party. They're not representing the majority anymore. So they have to use the tactics of an autocratic minority. How do you feel about that?
I think it's an argument that many people support. And I think there's 2 explanations people give. So one explanation is what journalists and political scientists called asymmetric polarization. And the argument is basically, since the 1980s, and I think this is actually right, we have partisan polarization, but the story is Republicans have moved much further to the right than Democrats as a whole have moved to the left. And that Republicans have become much more extreme in what they're willing to do for partisan gain than Democrats. And I believe that's true too. I'm happy to talk about why. The second part, once you understand that mentality, is this idea that the Republican electorate is increasingly a smaller part of the nation. And the argument is the heart of the Trump coalition has been rural, white, less educated voters, while Democrats have been expanding their reach. And we've seen this now in Georgia, Texas. It didn't work out, but the numbers are changing with suburbanization and higher education. So what do you do if you're not on a trajectory to expand your base? You depend on institutional supports that many Democrats certainly feel work against democracy. Very rigid, meticulous gerrymandering of districts. The Electoral College, which creates this discrepancy, not this year, but the previous election, between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, or even more ruthless tactics. I'm sure what he would probably say what we're watching now is exactly what happens. He lost the election, but he's trying through investigations and disinformation, the president, to still win. And so I think there is a lot to that. I don't think it explains what all Republicans are doing, but I think we've seen a lot of this with the leadership. And I always talk about, when people are asking about Trump, I always remember the Tea Party in 2011. They were in the House. They were in a battle with President Obama over the budget. And one of the things they did, the Tea Party said, they're not going to raise the debt ceiling. And what that means is they wouldn't allow Congress to pay for the money that they've already agreed to spend.
Wow.
That would send the country into default. That's a really hard-nosed tactic to take, and they were very serious from everything we know. Even Speaker Boehner said they were serious about this as he separated himself from them. So I think there's something very powerful to that argument. I think Republicans have to reckon with it. And what they're watching right now, how do you see it as proof of anything but?
But that analysis has to recognize that an increasingly small minority does not equate to 71 million people.
No, that's true. That's true. No, that is true. But kind of the last two presidential elections in 2000 and 2016, Republicans did not win the popular vote. They didn't win the popular vote, and they won the presidency. And the Senate creates disproportionate power also for smaller states where a lot of these Republicans are bunched up. And I think that's still very true. I do think the 71 million votes, though, is relevant. We don't yet know what all that was about. We're going to learn. But I think overall it's an accurate argument.
Let's hear some other questions or comments. Steve Schlesinger.
Hi, Julian. There's an old saying that Republicans treat elections as war. Democrats treat it as a game. And in the sense that the Republicans are willing to be totally ruthless in achieving victory. Democrats treat it as, something you go through as an exercise, and you win, you lose, but you don't demonize or try to destroy your opposition. This is not something new. When Jefferson was running for presidency, they went after him about his mistress. This kind of warfare has gone on throughout our history, but in the contemporary time, it does seem like the Republicans have a more vicious attitude towards elections than the Democrats, or maybe I'm just seeing it from the position of being a Democrat myself.
Anybody else? Go ahead. Sorry, Julian.
No, I think that is accurate. And I think you have to distinguish between the idea that politics is always hardball in the United States. Democratic politics gets ugly, it gets tough. But I do think we're witnessing in the last couple of decades a willingness within the context of where we are to go extremely far in political battle. That's part of what I'm trying to write about in the book. I always think that political leaders basically balance three objectives. One is partisanship and partisan power. The second is governing and the need to reach solutions on key issues. And the third is the health of democratic institutions. And I do think that the party has reached a place now where partisanship triumphs above all else, and it manifests itself in elections. I mean, we're now seeing not kind of attacks and here and there tough punches. We're seeing total disinformation being used as a normal part of campaigns. Now we're seeing something I believe is quite dangerous, to just go after the election results like this in such systematic fashion and create a sense of illegitimacy. And I have a quote in the book from Steve Bannon himself, who advised Trump and said, this gets to what you're saying, Steve. Republicans go for the head wound and Democrats come for a pillow fight. And I think it gets to, it's because of one thing in particular. Ultimately, Democrats are a party that believes in government. Government is central to their platform. This is something shared by progressives and moderates. Republicans have been a party since Reagan that doesn't make government central to their platform. If you are a party that doesn't prioritize government, you're going to be more willing to do whatever you need to do. If it makes Washington dysfunctional, so be it. That's your argument. You don't need the government. Whereas Democrats can't do that. They believe in government, they believe in governance, they believe in what Washington is. And so I think it perpetually checks, not all of the party. Certainly there's a lot of Democrats who will go very far, but as a majority, look, the difference between Biden and Trump is night and day in terms of the way they practice their politics. So I think that's why you see it. Just compare Hillary Clinton after the election to Trump after the election. Night and day. And you won't see a concession now. And it's not just that you won't see a concession, you won't even see an admission of the results.
Anybody else? Martin?
You can unmute yourself, Martin. It's on
The
the,
little microphone on the lower left. Put the red, click on it to get the red line out.
Did I do it?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay, actually, I didn't have my hand up. I just came in for part of the talk and I just wanted to say I totally enjoyed it and I'm glad I'm here. And just going forward, I wonder whether Trump really wanted ever to be president. I mean, I think in 2016, he was trying to run maybe just to enhance a brand. And he could have then, done stuff on the outside, had a TV show or maintained and enhanced his businesses. And the presidency almost slowed him down in a sense and made him sort of, what do you think about that?
It's a plausible theory. I don't know the answer. On the one hand, you have these remarks he's made throughout the last few decades, including the 80s, where he said he wanted to be president. He considered running for president several times. And there's a path where you can imagine he's not enamored with being president, but he loves the power that comes with it. And he loves what beats being the center of attention than this. But on the other hand, I think that's part of the thin commitment he has to the issues a president does, that it might be both, that he was eager to be president and have the power, but he didn't really want the presidency. And he's just disinterested in what comes with it. I don't know the answer. That'll be one of the questions we look at as we study this presidency and have a better sense of what he was about. But I think it's a plausible argument.
Thank you.
One more.
I want to add a quick program note, and that is that Martin Levinson, who just made that, or asked that question, will be speaking at the library on December 3rd via Zoom about, I don't have the title right here, Marty, but I think it's the 6 strangest presidents presidencies or presidential elections?
No, it's six, the six strangest presidential elections so far.
Okay, well, we'll have that seventh one, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well,
I-
we're glad he's presuming that there will be another election.
Yeah, exactly.
There
All
was
right.
a question from another Martin, so please ask away.
Hi, yeah, just with the whole thing of Trump now trying to invalidate the voting altogether through various attacks and legal means, what is the possibility or likelihood that we might standardize and rationalize the balloting process across the 50 states so they're all taking mail-in votes 30 days out from the election? They're all allowing people to vote in person 15 days out from the election. And they're allowing everyone to count the votes that are mailed in as they come in, as opposed to starting the day of the election. What are the chances that that changes to avoid the worst of the claims of fraud and abuse?
Look, I hope this becomes a window for the country to address so many flaws in how we handle our elections. And there's for a long time been, pushes for more federal support and federal standards in how this is done, what the machines are like. With mail-in voting this time around, in March, the speaker was trying to urge that we do more from the federal government to prepare the states. But and there's a lot of people who argue this should be a reason to restore the Voting Rights Act so that we protect the vote in many states where it's been restricted regardless of the pandemic. But remember 2000, it was equally chaotic. And there were a lot of calls after that for ending the Electoral College and pushing for bold reforms. We got some, but I don't think we got nearly as far as some of the commissions that were put into place after were demanding. So I don't know. These are really hard issues to sustain interest in once the election is gone. And we're going to be turning to getting out of the pandemic, to restoring the economic vitality. I don't know, but we need to create a more rational and a stronger system. And this should be an opportunity. Look, the absentee ballots, I mean, one thing it showed is how many people want to vote, and it made it easier for people to vote. And it doesn't have to be a pandemic. People have been saying for a long time, we need a holiday on election day. We need better early voting, better absentee voting. I hope this is a reason to do that. Our goal should not be to restrict the vote. It should be to get as many people to vote as we can get. We've been on a bad decline in the 20th and 21st century. So let's hope that's a productive thing to come out of this.
I think that's a good last word. We're about out of time. So without Penny waving her finger at me, I want to say thanks again and a big virtual hand to Princeton professor Julian Zelizer,
Thank you.
author of Burning Down the House, available at our local bookstore, and to Penny Wright as retiring director of adult programs like this one at the Rogers Memorial Library. It's been a pleasure working with you. Also to library technical wizard Joanna Farron, and to you in Zoom Hampton for joining us. Stay well all.
I'd like to just say a quick goodbye because this is my last program at the Rogers Memorial Library.
Oh,
So, and I tell you, we picked a good one to be the last one because Professor Zelizer, you've given us a lot to think about, and it's been a real pleasure to have you. And David, you were an excellent foil for Professor Zelizer. And thank you all for being here tonight. And I hope to see you around the neighborhood.